Okay, welcome everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Great. All right, so my name is Rob Blair. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. I am also co-founder and co-director of the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a partnership of researchers, students, policymakers, and practitioners committed to using evidence to better understand and confront threats to democracy around the world. I'm hosting the event today alongside my two co-directors, Professor Laura Paylor from American University and Professor Jessica Gottlieb from the University of Houston. And we're excited to welcome you all to the first event in our Democratic Erosion Evidence Brief series. This event centers on our just published Democratic Erosion Evidence Brief, how effective are media literacy interventions at countering misinformation in the global South. And you can download a copy of the brief from our website, and I will see if I can drop a link in the chat. I don't know if I can do that, but somebody hopefully can. Okay, so this brief grew out of a wider evidence review commissioned by USAID on the effectiveness of a range of approaches to combating misinformation. And for this brief, we chose to zero in on media literacy since this was one of the interventions that generated the most discussion when we shared the broader review with folks like you in the audience. So what we hope to accomplish today is twofold. First, to share what some of the highest quality research can teach us about the effectiveness of media literacy programming. And second, to spend some time thinking about how we can better incorporate evidence when designing and implementing media literacy interventions in the future. So now I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Laura, who will introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and explain the format of the event. So our first panelist today is Brendan Nyhan. He is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. He is a co-author on the brief and will launch our discussion today by giving a short presentation on the main results and the main recommendations. We're then going to have about a 20-minute discussion among our panelists to hear their reactions to the findings, as well as their ideas for incorporating evidence into media literacy programming more widely. So we are very pleased today to have with us Sumitra Badrinathan, who is an assistant professor of political science at American University School of International Service. She is also the author of one of the briefs that we discuss, or one of the studies that we discuss in the brief. And we also have Allison Campbell, Senior Technical Advisor at Internews. So after we have the 20-minute panel discussion, we're then going to turn it over and spend the last 20 to 25 minutes of the workshop fielding questions for Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat or thumbs up other questions that people have posed to indicate your interest in hearing an answer. And DEC co-director Jessica Gottlieb is going to be leading the Q&A portion at the end. So with that, Brendan, I will turn it over to you for the presentation of our results and our recommendations.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So what I'll be doing is giving a high-level overview of the key findings from the report and from the brief and the recommendations that we offer. So in the time I have, it won't be possible to get into the details of specific studies, but of course, we can do that in the Q&A and panel discussion. There's more detail on the studies that we drew on in the longer report that this brief summarizes. So we can provide that information to you if it's helpful. So as my colleague suggested, the reason we focus on media literacy interventions is because they're seen as potentially important as a way of responding to misinformation around the world, and especially in the global South, where it may have where it may be of particularly significant concern. We observed a great deal of optimism among our experts that when we surveyed them for the longer report that this brief draws on. They identified media literacy interventions as one of the most important interventions to invest in countering misinformation in the global South. So we thought it was important to summarize the evidence we have on how effective these interventions are. The evidence is, of course, always limited, and we'd like more, but we think there's enough to draw some firm conclusions that can inform both research and practice going forward. And I'll note that the evidence we're drawing on, we're really focusing in on two outcomes. What people believe when we ask them about true and false claims. Are they able to apply what they've learned in these media literacy interventions to better distinguish between true and false claims, in both what they believe and then second, what they choose to share, or at least they tell us they would share on social media. And both of those are important outcomes you might think about. And note that I said distinguish between true and false information. We're really interested in interventions that help people make that distinction rather than simply making them distrusting of all information, which would be a really harmful kind of outcome. So our first conclusion is that media literacy interventions are effective in some but not all cases. The evidence is mixed. And we think that's important because it reminds us that we need to be both learning how to make these interventions more effective, as well as identifying the context in which they might be most appropriate. Okay, but there is evidence that they can be effective, and we'll talk about the conditions under which that might take place. Specifically, we find that there's some evidence that media literacy interventions might be more effective among people who are more educated and or digitally literate. This, I think, is a disappointing finding to some folks because, of course, part of the idea of an intervention like this is to help people who don't come in with those skills to help them better make sense of the information that they're evaluating. However, it may also be the case that people actually need that background or those skills in order to apply what they've learned effectively. And so we think it's important to take that context into account in thinking about how your media literacy intervention might work, what population you're targeting, whether they have the skills and background to apply that effectively. To give you just a single example, I was a co-author on a study where we provided tips for spotting false news to both a highly educated sample we recruited online in India, which was very educated and digitally literate, and a face-to-face, a separate set of respondents who we recruited via a face-to-face survey in a rural area where baseline levels of education and media literacy were much lower. And we found the media literacy intervention was effective with that more educated online sample, but not with that less educated face-to-face sample. A third conclusion we come to is that just simply teaching these people these techniques may not be enough. It may be important to think about the motivations they have to apply them or the other kinds of factors that might influence what they choose to believe and choose to share, because those may interfere and in this way reduce the effectiveness of the interventions in question. So we identify emotions, social norms, and group attachments as three kinds of factors that might be relevant in thinking about what people choose to believe or choose to share. And to the extent that we can potentially influence those factors, that may help make these interventions more effective, or at least prevent their effectiveness from being diminished by those potentially competing motives. Okay. A fourth conclusion is that when these interventions are more intensive, in other words, they take longer, they're more involved, people are provided with more information, or there's more repetition of the information, at least in the evidence so far, we don't find a strong correspondence between the level of intensity of the treatment provided in the intervention and the outcomes. And these effects that we observe, moreover, are not necessarily durable. So in combination, we think it's important to think about how to take those findings into account when you're rolling out your own programs. You may want to think, if the effects aren't durable, we should time our interventions to especially important moments, or think about how we could retreat people over time, because those effects may not last. In addition, it may be the case that because intensity doesn't have as strong a correspondence with effect size as we might hope, you might prefer a lighter touch intervention that reaches a larger number of people, reaches a larger audience, right? Rather than targeting in on some much smaller group and devoting a lot of resources to treating them very intensively, that may not, our evidence suggests, at least so far, translate into more significant outcomes. So the three recommendations we offer going forward for future practice are, first, to consider the target population. Who are you trying to reach? In particular, what are their education and media literacy levels, and what are the kinds of motivations that might be relevant to them, whether they're emotions that might be that the content in question might provoke, or the social norms or group attachments they have. And then finally, it's important to think about these durability effects and intensity of treatment effects in considering how to allocate your resources, rather than simply assuming that more treatment will lead to stronger or more durable outcomes. Okay, I'll leave it there and turn it over to the panel. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. So now I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists, Alison and Sumitra. Brendan, also feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. I am going to ask people to try to keep their responses to about 2 to 3 minutes, just so that we can get through as many questions as possible. But I'd like to start with this point that Brendan mentioned about the evidence that media literacy interventions in the Global South may work best for populations that are already more educated or more digitally literate. So often when we're thinking of these interventions, we want to try to reach those populations that might have lower levels of education. And it really suggests that we need to think hard about how to design interventions to target these groups. So Sumitra, I'd actually like to start with you. The study that you did that we talk about in the brief, you conducted it in Bihar, which is a state with one of the lowest levels of education in India. Can you tell us a little bit about your main results and about how these education levels in Bihar might have contributed to the results, and the fact that you actually find null results on average from your intervention?
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks for having me. Okay, so just to very briefly tell everybody what the study was about. Bihar is is a population with pretty low levels of literacy and formal education in India. It's one of the poorest states of India, and the study that I conducted back in 2019 when we had elections in India was entirely in that state. We knocked on doors and provided people with a 1-hour face-to-face conversation that included tips, skills, and some tools in order to identify fake news and misinformation, broadly sort of labeled as a media literacy face-to-face intervention. We found that on average, people that got that intervention compared to people that didn't were not better off in any discernible way. So after this pretty intensive intervention, media literacy training didn't make them better off. But just to come back to Laura's point, correlationally, we do find that people with higher levels of education were better at discerning true from false information in that study. So just to kind of answer the question that you posed, Laura, I think part of this is that it's not just that education differs in people who are better able to identify misinformation, but also the kinds of formats and the kinds of interventions that we're able to use will also differ. So for example, in Bihar, where I often go for field work, only 1 in 3 households has a stable internet connection. Most people don't have their own cell phones. And when they do, they share them with other members of their family. So that necessitates that for us as surveyors, we have to go knock on doors. That also means that a lot of the video and text-based interventions are not going to be widely applicable. And when they are, they're going to be consumed at higher rates, or the information in them is going to be understood better by a significant systematic proportion of the population. That happens to be a population that's educated. So that's just to say that it's not just education, but other factors differ too in the kinds of information that people with and without education are able to consume. And important in that is the format of the media literacy intervention. But I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that it's not just the content of the interventions that we put out into the field, but also whether or not there is demand from the side of the citizen, right? So you have to kind of make sure while doing interventions that citizens understand the information in them, that the information is new to them, and conditional on those factors that they prioritize the issue area that you care about. From my fieldwork in India, especially with rural populations with low education, they will tell you they care about misinformation, but at the end of the day, they care more about feeding their families. So trying to get people's attention for an intervention like this is very hard. And that's something that I think we all have to pay a little bit more attention to going forward when we design interventions. It's certainly a problem that I keep facing whenever I go to the field.
Great. Thank you so much, Sumitra. Alison, I'd like to ask you the same question. So based on your experience at Internews, how does Internews think about these efforts to target maybe more or less educated populations? What has your experience been? And how might we design more effective interventions for targeting less educated populations?
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, I should say at the outset that Internews work in this area is usually not directed at scale at the general kind of consumer population. We work with journalists, other creators and providers of media and information, human rights defenders, civil society communicators. Those are generally our target populations. And so these kinds of participants are definitely literate and usually at least somewhat media literate. The other thing to say is that we're very seldom funded to do randomized controlled trials. And so everything that we speak about is really, within the limitations of regular project-based monitoring and evaluation. I would say, though, that there is one larger scale impact study that's worth speaking about, and it's India again, between September 2020 and January 2021. We had 253 trainers deliver what we call the FACT Shala training program that involved 23,300 something adults in communities across India, mainly what they call tier 2 and 3 cities, that's relatively low literacy levels, and also in villages. It was delivered in 10 languages and dialects, mainly through online sessions. Students, teachers, representatives from NGOs and civil society organizations, and self-employed people. And we looked at understanding their information ecosystem, developing critical thinking around information, and fact-checking and verifying information. There's quite a long impact report that's available on this. Overall, we can say that we were very content with the results of the post-training testing. Some of it, but not all of it, was self-reported. So this is not randomized control testing. So in general, we're not working with these lower literacy populations, but this quite large scale study produced, at least in the short term, pretty pleasing results. So the question of durability still remains, both for low literacy populations and also for journalists and other communicators. And we definitely, through other tracks of our work, which I think we're going to get on to talk about in a while, consider the context of our target trainees or participants to be equally, if not more important, than their actual skills and literacy.
Were there any particular insights coming out of that program about what was most effective for getting these populations to respond to the intervention?
I am afraid that this was not a piece of research that I did. I can make it available for people who are interested in the ins and outs of it, but I don't really have those numbers off the top of my head.
No, thank you. It's so interesting because these are the exact kind of interventions that I think can really inform deeper thinking and developing and testing different strategies to try to reach these target populations. So that's very helpful. Thank you. So now I would like to turn to this more general finding that the results on the effectiveness of media literacy interventions are mixed. So some of the studies do show that they have a positive effect on average. Other studies show that they do not always have a positive effect. And this raises, I think, important questions about how to determine the most productive ways forward if we have a sense that maybe something is not working. So Sumitra, back to you. I know that you're doing another study in India right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how the null results from that first intervention inform the design of your new project and what you're working on now?
Absolutely. So I've been reflecting for the last several years on the null results from that first project. And one of the things that struck me about that project was that while the intervention didn't work overall, it did work for a small subset of that sample, and that was the subset that did not support the ruling government at the time. It didn't work, on the other hand, or it actually made people worse off when they supported the ruling party, which means that at some level, people were responding expressively to what we told them. People whose priors and political partisanship was aligned with that of the ruling government didn't like that we were telling them that information that they wanted to believe that was actually false was actually false. On the other hand, people that didn't support the ruling government didn't have many emotional or partisan ties to the misinformation that was out there, were actually able to learn from that treatment, right? And this finding kind of mirrors existing work in political science, economics, and psychology about our our motivation as human beings to consume information that is in line with our priors. And that's called motivated reasoning. And we know that adults in many countries are resistant to information that goes against these priors. We also know from prior work that adolescents are way more malleable because they're at an age where views have not been crystallized yet they're forming identities about themselves and opinions about the world. So one of the changes that I made from the last project to the new one that I'm now running, that I'll talk about in a second, is that we've shifted the target population from adults to adolescents. So I have an intervention on the field right now in Bihar, coincidentally working with the same people who run Fakshala in India, which is an NGO called Data Leads, which is trying to run a randomized control trial with adolescents aged 13 to 17. So roughly grades 9 to 12. This intervention is currently in the field and it's going to be done soon, so we'll have results in a couple of months. But there are a bunch of innovations apart from the fact that we're just studying adolescents in that particular context. The first is that because of learning difficulties, we've sort of found through fieldwork and through the failure of the last project that one thing that might help with rural populations and populations with less exposure to internet and digital literacy is repeated training. So repeating the same content over and over again until people have learned it. And that's kind of the basis of education, or education psychologists will tell you that that's what they do in a classroom. So one of the other innovations that we do with this project is that our intervention is a classroom-based repeated training that takes place over the course of a semester. And I'm happy to go into what exactly that training looks like and so on and so forth. But just to keep the time and broadly to answer your question. So my two takeaways were study a younger population, and that's what we're doing, and do it over a period of time, and that's also what we're doing. This is called the Bihar Information and Media Literacy Initiative, shortened to BIMLI, and it's currently being rolled out in over 600 villages in Bihar, targeting over 14,000 adolescents, with about half of those in the treatment group, and we should have results in a few months from that.
Great, thank you. That's very exciting. So Allison, I'd like to follow up by asking you, so, in response to sort of the null findings that we find for some of these media literacy interventions, how might these kinds of findings impact Internews's programmatic strategies? To what extent are these findings valuable, and how might they be taken on board?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to come at this a little bit sideways, I think, because at Internews, we see mis and disinformation as an information ecosystemic problem that comes from relationships between all sorts of factors on the supply side of information and on the demand side, which is where we see human behavior kicking in and identity and that kind of thing. So we don't approach our work with an expectation that a single tactic like media literacy alone, that we would show impact on an overall information ecosystem. We can show that a media literacy training was effective in impacting a journalist's work and had a positive impact on the quality of the work that journalist produced, and that makes the supply side of the information ecosystem healthier. But to understand the impact of that on consumers of that information is another matter altogether. Consumers who may or may not gravitate towards that improved content depending on their context. And at local levels in communities where we work, we see such a hugely diverse landscape of information behaviors. There's a high vulnerability at community level information ecosystems, because it's not only about factually incorrect information, it's also about localized rumor, misunderstandings, local politicking, cultural beliefs, internecine conflict dynamics, and all of these other influences that can muddy the situation and undermine the capacity of that community to make coherent decisions. So media literacy trainings for local information creators do form a part of Internews's community-based interventions. But because these local ecosystems are so unique and unpredictable, we really emphasize the need first for human-centered research to look at these highly localized dynamics around trust, who people trust, who they share with, who influences them, and those kinds of factors. So I know that was a bit of a curveball in terms of, the null findings for a specific intervention, but we do take a much more ecosystemic approach. We would always try to have more than one kind of intervention running at any one time.
Brendan raised his hand.
I just wanted to echo Sumitra's point about working with adolescents as just an important avenue for folks to consider. There's a lot of large-scale media literacy work being done and not being evaluated, especially carefully, as far as I can tell, around the world. So there's a real opportunity there to grow the evidence base and to reach people in ways that are very challenging with adult populations, right? We talked about, Sumitra correctly, I think, identified demand as a real issue, right? Adults are busy and have, lots of competing pressures on their time. In the school context, right, we have an opportunity to reach people when they're in a way that we're going to at least have more of their attention than we might out there in the world. And those political, motivations she described might be lower. So I just want to kind of emphasize how much potential there might be there to reach people, and in some cases to improve existing programs or test them more rigorously. That might be a lot easier than trying to stand up something from scratch and reach adults who are, where you always have this problem that the people you may be reaching with some adult-oriented program may be the kinds of folks who need that intervention the least. They're precisely the ones who end up paying more attention to content of that type.
Thank you, Brendan. Actually, so Allison, can I also come back to a point that you were making? So I think that it's really, and I'm going to turn this around to Brendan and Sumitra as well. I think this is a really interesting point about thinking about the broader information ecosystem and the fact that there are lots of different factors that determine supply and demand, and the contexts vary a lot, and these interventions can often be complex. So I guess one question for Allison, and I'll ask you to go first, is, so if you were to get, information that maybe a media literacy intervention wasn't working on the demand side for kinds of the reasons that we've been talking about, how does that affect what you do on the supply side? So for instance, if, we're finding it's hard for citizens to want to use information or to have the skills, how does that change the supply side training or interventions that you do? And then I'm going to turn this around to Brendan and Sumitra and ask, what can we as research, given that these are complex environments and studying one-off interventions might not give us a complete picture, what more can we do on the research side to think about addressing multiple components, how they go together, how do we think about supply and demand? But Allison, I'll ask you to start.
Yes, the work that we do, we are best known for working with journalists and media, but we do have a whole suite of community-based work where media may be absent, lacking, or not trusted. And this is where we plug directly into communities to track and analyze rumors and information behaviors in that community, the choices they make about accessing and sharing, etc. And what we've learned really speaks to the importance of this business of community ties and identity in all instances, not just with groups where, in polarized situations, in groups and out groups. So our key takeaway here is that the source of the information is at least as important as the content itself. It's kind of intuitive, but also open to researching. You know, information from trusted sources spreads and sticks, even if the information itself is of low quality. So trusted sources tend to lie close to the consumer. And really the business of, so what we do on the supply side is ideally to localize the supply side is potentially infinite, especially where internet access is involved. The closer that we can come to the supply side that is meaningful to communities, that includes their local community-based sources. We often say that there is the only supply side that matters is the supply side that matters to our target audience, let's say, or our target community. So work that can seed local information solutions. It doesn't have to be a media outlet necessarily, but a coalition of information providers, civic-minded information providers, for instance, in the community, can be a super helpful adjunct to work with the demand side. When people have recourse to a local source that they identify as being trusted, that's the ideal thing that we would like to plug in on the supply side there. It kind of gives us a wider attack surface, if you like, that is embedded in that community, than simply trying to deal with the infinite supply side that is potentially available.
Thank you. Brendan, Smita, would you care to comment? So I think this is a really interesting question about how we need to factor in sort of the trust in the information providers with our media literacy interventions. I know there's some work that's been done on this, perhaps not that much in the Global South, but you know, to what extent is this important? Has this factored into your own work? And then I think there is still this broader question of how do we tackle sort of the whole information ecosystem in terms of biting off components if we want to study the causal effects of these interventions with respecting the complexity, but also balancing that with the demand of wanting to know, you know, is it really the intervention that is driving some outcome that we care about? Sumitra, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can start. I actually want to start by providing just a little bit more context on the demand side in India, especially in Bihar. And that is that generally in India, the state of public education and primary schooling is pretty dismal. And Bihar might be a state where it's way worse than the rest of the country, right? So a recent report actually found that 8th and 9th grade students in India have 2nd grade reading and speaking comprehension level. Absenteeism in public schools is really high. And that's not just on the side of students, that's also on the side of teachers. Oftentimes people who are auditing for this study kind of went to public schools and found that classrooms were just empty, schools didn't have electricity, a lot of very basic state capacity failure and provision issues, right? Children skip school because they work for their families instead because they come from very poor families. So if we're thinking about media literacy in contexts like this being successful, it necessarily depends on schooling being successful. And very quickly into the study that I just described, I realized earlier that we, as policymakers, stakeholders, civil society, can design the best possible experiments, but their execution depends on state capacity, which has nothing to do with media literacy. So for instance, it's not just getting kids to school when they don't want to go to school because their parents want them to work instead. It's also ensuring that girls can travel safely to areas where schooling or media literacy is going to take place. So I think very quickly we realized that beyond designing the perfect media literacy curriculum, whatever that is, whether that's a video-based text message, whether that's in classroom, the content will only take you so far if you can't get people to buy in. And that's been a constant challenge, and by no means I can say that our project has solved it. One thing, though, to answer your question that we tried to do to get around this is that we got government buy-in. And if you know anything about India, getting the government to sign off on a misinformation counter intervention was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, but they did. So what we're doing through this project is we're offering media literacy as a government certificate course. So students are not getting paid to go to it. but it's being advertised as a government course that they get a certificate at the end of it with a stamp from that government agency, and a stamp from all of the partners involved. And that certificate gets delivered to them, and they get to say that they were a part of this program that was sponsored by government. We don't know if that's going to work. It seems to have worked at the initial stage where we knocked on doors and asked people if they were interested in participating in this kind of program. But we've now been running this thing for 8 months, and we're four co-authors, and we kind of keep going on and off to the field. So from the experience and qualitative work that we've got from there, there's still a decent amount of absenteeism in schools. So we're never going to get perfect compliance with this treatment. But then the question then becomes, what is good compliance given that the status quo is pretty bad to begin with? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I guess I'm just saying that the problems with demand go way beyond just wanting information. They at some point shift to logistical issues that I found myself pretty helpless in trying to solve, such as women's safety and so on and so forth. So it's a non-answer to your question, but I just wanted to make that point.
Great, thanks so much. Brendan? Also, sorry, Brendan, we're about to turn to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. Brendan?
Yes, please ask questions. So what I want to add on the supply side was I've increasingly thought we should pay attention to the supply side, in part because it's easier to scale what we do there. There's just fewer folks to reach. And when it comes to sources that people trust and pay attention to, right? I think the conversation has drawn this distinction out nicely. The internet has infinite sources of information, but the ones that people trust and rely on is actually a much more limited set. And so in some cases, that could be things that are interventions that are outside the scope of media literacy training directly. But for instance, in our brief, we show results. We also asked experts about training of media members themselves, journalist training. That's an intermediary that can reach a lot of people, as well as messaging or other kinds of interventions targeting politicians, which are often a critical source of misinformation. But even in a more specific sense, it sounded like Allison was describing something like this, reaching key intermediaries, community leaders, and other folks who in turn are trusted sources in their communities may be a more effective strategy in a lot of contexts than going directly to the public, given all the obstacles we've identified. I've always been struck by the reporting I read about the aftermath of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And there was a period immediately afterward where largely Western scientists and doctors started telling people not to mourn their dead in a traditional way. And they were often literally chased out of villages at the time. And it was only when they began to work through trusted community leaders and intermediaries, and they first came to them with their concerns about how the mourning and burial practices were worsening the epidemic. And after working with them and helping them understand the risks associated with what they were doing, they were able to, in turn, have those folks broker changes in the mourning and burial practices that limited that transmission. So I think that's a great example of how that two-step process can be really effective. And there may be those intermediaries out there who you could reach. And of course, who those are is going to depend on the context.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to turn it over to Q&A in just 2 or 3 minutes. I do want to ask one speed round question before I turn it over. So for each of you, are there any key recommendations coming out of this discussion or the report that you would like to make for policymakers and practitioners, or key areas of learning where you think that we really need to collect new evidence? So Allison, to you.
Well,
first.
I think you know what I'm going to say, which is just pretty much, where Brendan was going. And that is the human-centered research on the ground that can give us deeper insights as to how important, the community-based approaches need to be.
Great, thank you. Sumitra?
I'm going to say that I think it just takes a really, really long amount of time to build an evidence base where we can be sure whether we know and don't know things. I keep thinking about how in the US, the finding that partisanship predicts everything is now kind of commonly known, right? Not just political attitudes, but also down to the kind of car you buy and your Starbucks drink. We're so far away, I think, from knowing what works whether media literacy works, especially in contexts like India, because there are so few studies to go off of. Bihar has about 150 million people, but it's 1 out of 30 states in India. And I wouldn't even say that it's representative of all of India. I mean, it is an outlier, to be honest. So I don't know, taking a step back, if I can even say anything about all of India, right? I can maybe say something about Bihar, but even then it's going to be a function of the particular kind of studies that I did. So I guess my recommendation is that we don't know until we really know, and that takes time. So perhaps we should start doing a lot more until we can be sure. And I certainly don't know about what worked. I can't answer the question of what works and what doesn't in a more kind of generalizable way.
Great. Thank you. Brendan?
Yeah, these are important points. You know, it is going to take some time. And so that's why, you know, we can't, I guess the point I would offer is we can't wait. We have to move quickly to build this evidence base. Looking for opportunities, essentially, I would just say low cost and no cost randomizations or ways to capture outcome data as well, right? So you know, the model can't be $1 million gold star RCT or nothing. There's a huge range in between, and there are lots of ways to strengthen the evidentiary contributions of the work you do. It always feels like a lower priority, but again, think of how much money is spent in the aggregate on these kinds of efforts. That that evidence you contribute will leverage all those future dollars more effectively. So it's really a kind of investment in the work that your organization does, as well as everyone else in the field.
Great. Thank you. So with that, we are going to turn it over to Professor Jessica Gottlieb to lead the Q&A and continue the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your contributions already to this conversation. And we have some great questions in the chat. So I'm going to start with the first one that was asked by Letitia Small. And she's asking about the finding that we talked about at the start, wherein more educated populations were more responsive to treatment. And she's asking, what exactly does that mean? So can we unpack what we mean by baseline literacy or skills? Are there, how were those things measured? How do we know if we were going to target, I think, those folks, or even build those skills foundationally before providing media literacy? Let's see, maybe Sumitra, you can start, and then Brendan and Allison.
Yeah, I can start, but I don't have too much of a nuanced insight on this, because my finding from the one study that I did that we discussed earlier is simply correlational. We measured people's level of education by what they said their level of education was, so they self-reported education. And then we just correlated that with outcomes at the end and found that those with higher levels of education on a continuous scale were better off. It wasn't an experimental or a causal finding, so I don't know how much stock I would put into that. That said, in the current study, because our study is in an educational setting, and it is an educational study in some sense, we're going to be able to measure this more systematically. Our base population is children who are already enrolled in school, but they're at different levels of schooling. But we're going to see if their parents' level of schooling beforehand affects how they respond to the treatment, because we're expecting that students will go home and talk to their family members about it. We're also expecting that people who attend all of our sessions are those that are pushed by their families to do that as opposed to doing something else. And we think that has something to do with prior levels of education. So I'm hoping that I'll have a more comprehensive answer to that question going forward.
Thank you. Brendan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say I don't have a list of the soft skills exactly. I guess in my work, we found some evidence that background knowledge was important, and I'll just give you an example of that. So this list of tips that Facebook shared for spotting false news offered a series of suggestions for, you know, have you heard of this source, and is the claim too good to be true, and so forth. Kind of a series of heuristic reasoning steps you could take that might help you evaluate information more effectively. And one thing we found in the US, we haven't done this specifically in India, but you might imagine this kind of thing applies, was that people appeared to downgrade their evaluation of less known sources. They were less likely to think that sources they weren't weren't widely known were making accurate claims. So in the aggregate, that made their ability to distinguish between true and false information good, because the news coming from those better known media outlets was more reliable in the context of our study. And I think that's generally true, although obviously not perfect. But you had to, of course, know which sources were the widely known reputable ones and which weren't, right? And the place where our respondents didn't do as well were the reputable organizations that weren't as familiar to people. So, an example in the US would be Politico, which is a widely known, reputable political news outlet, but really for kind of insiders and political junkies. Normal people don't know anything about it, right? So those kinds of sources people were downgrading too. And that's just an example of how this background knowledge really becomes critical. I mean, I'll tell you, like, talking to normal people about US fact checks, I have a family member I talk to about it, and she looks at these and she has no idea, it's competing claims from sources people have never heard of involving an issue that they don't have a lot of background on. There's just a lot you have to put together there often just to even understand what's at stake before you even start to think about what's true. So I guess that's something I think about a lot. And I could see it as a reason why, for instance, other kinds of approaches that don't rely on helping people sort all that out might be more effective. There's a box in the brief that I'll recommend to people, and this is the last thing I'll say and turn it over to Allison, about a promising intervention conducted in Kenya via text message by a group led by Susan Athey at Stanford. And they found that a training helping people kind of realize the emotional response they were having to content and how to kind of avoid being made angry or scared by the kinds of things they were seeing was as effective as a kind of content-based media literacy type intervention, right? And that might at least be a way forward that doesn't rely so much on people needing to make these sorts of complex cognitive judgments.
Thank you. Allison, do you want to add anything to this?
I could just quickly say something which lies ahead of us a little bit, but because we mainly do work with media cohorts who have some relative sophistication of media literacy, one thing that's becoming important for us is to be able to, in the way of background, just following on from what Brendan was saying, at the level of media, it's important for them to have more than just the technical navigation skills of understanding whether a link or a post is put there by a bot, or the link is, threatening, or the photograph is fake, but actually a greater understanding of what the specific mis and disinformation threats in their country are. Because we talk about mis and disinformation very generally for the whole world. And yet in each country, specific actors have specific objectives, political and social, and they have specific narratives that support them, and they specifically target certain audiences. So although we tend to assume that all people everywhere get all mis and disinformation all the time, it can be really helpful for the sort of gatekeepers in the media to have a better grasp of what specific threats, actors, target groups, what do they want, what impact are they seeking, so that we can narrow down the focus of where that particular literacy is going, not least so that they can inform populations of the specific threats, so that everybody doesn't have to necessarily worry about everything all the time.
Thanks, Allison. That's really important. And, in recent conversations with researchers, people have been, I think, trying to think more about what the different types of misinformation are about, exactly because then you can pinpoint who the actors are that are seeking to misinform and what the different populations they might be targeting are, so that we're not going in and trying to treat everybody in the same way when this is a really segregated sort of group of actors. There's a related question, and it speaks to some of the things that came up in the recent answers from Habiba about this idea of trust in the source. And we've all recognized here how the source of the misinformation matters a lot in one's ability to take it up. Also, the source of the correction matters a lot. And Brendan talked a little bit about how people's knowledge of the source and the source being credible matters. But we could also think about environments where journalism is quite weak and people are getting a lot of their information from other people and not necessarily media writ large. And so when people are, when that is the case, how do we think about the source, both of the misinformation and the source of any sort of correction or training? Have there been studies that you know of that try to get at this, or just experiences you've had? We can go in the same order, perhaps. Sumitra, do you want to take a first crack?
Yeah, I can start because I think the weak informational environment example that you gave perfectly describes India. Just to give an example, the Times of India, which is the leading English newspaper from India, from the Times Group, which is a global organization, recently published a tweet that then got picked up by every other media outlet out there that Nobel Prize laureate Amartya Sen had died. And that was just based off of purely fake information. And it didn't get taken down for a whole day after that, right? So when I think of sources and trying to get people to trust good sources, if you ask anybody, they would name the Times as the top English source in India. But if even the Times does this, then I don't know what we're left with, right? I actually struggle a lot with this idea of trying to downgrade the bad sources and get people to upvote the good sources, because I'm not sure what good means in the context of India anymore, because the informational environment has degraded so much, in part because of the government, but also in part because, from my understanding from local journalists, incentives to publish have changed because of payments that get made based off of views and hits rather than content. So it's all pretty bad, basically. One thing that we're trying to do in order to solve this is not focus on the primary source of information, but instead focus on the transmitter. So not trust the Times of India versus don't, but should you trust your uncle for health information as opposed to a doctor? Should you trust central government announcements and posters? And however bad those may be, I would still put stock into them, for example, about information on vaccines and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do is, through this classroom curriculum, engage people to trust transmitters more than original sources. We also have embedded a conjoint experiment in the end, trying to measure what exact factors people put stock into in trusting information. But I don't certainly have the answers to the question, because the source trust is something that I've always struggled with when it comes to India, and it seems now like the situation is getting worse. I know Allison has experience with this. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that.
Thank you. Brendan, anything to add? No. Okay. Allison, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, this is really our world, and it's so complex. And Sumitra did a really good job of just highlighting some of those issues: the broken business model for media, fragmentation of media, and all of the rest of it. I mean, for us, it's a kind of a no-brainer that media sources should be trained in media literacy like they're trained in basic ethical journalistic practices. And it is horrifying when major newspapers, like Times of India, do that kind of reporting. So for us, that's our absolute bread and butter. But to go back to and there are a lot of different ways of trying to address that, including through the business model. So that's an entire suite of work on the supply side. But when we're talking about community-based sources, if somebody says that they trust a source, there we have the emotion and the identity and everything else, and it's very hard to tell them not to. And if you go to that source and you find that source to be a partisan or paid or intrinsic, essentially corrupted source, there's not a whole lot that we can do about that. But again, to go back to this business of localizing information solutions, civic media, we call it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a sustainable media business, but we have in places in the States and in some other countries cultivated these. If you go into the community and talk to people and listen to people and find out who a likely set of ethical and civic-minded citizens may be, that's where we would focus our resources to create connections between those people. Some people have good information, but no networks. Some people have networks, but no good information. And we can create these kinds of linkages in these civic media initiatives that grow the base of reliable information. And people in that community can feel, can experience in their own lived experience, because that source is proximate to them, it's close. So when they're told something, the road is open, the lights are out, this sort of thing, their experience tells them that that's true. And that proximity plus relevance equals trust. That's another little mantra that we have in internews. And so that's how it's possible to grow trustable information sources in communities.
Thanks. That's really helpful, and it gets to the social aspect of misinformation. So far, we've talked a lot about the individual aspect, where someone is confronted with a piece of information and they're deciding whether or not to believe it or whether they think it's true. But a lot of times, studies also look at whether or not people are going to share that misinformation. And one of the comments in the chat was asking about potential problem for research, which is that if you have time between the intervention and the measurement of outcomes, that gives the chance for the intervention's effect to spread. So it might be difficult to separate the effect in the control group and the effect in the treatment group, or the outcomes, because you might have treatment members who are sort of spilling over their effect onto the control group. So the question was about how do we control for that in measurement? But I think we can also flip that question and think about how can we maximize or leverage the social benefit of our interventions? And do you know of interventions that explicitly ask participants to disseminate their learnings to their community, to talk about what they've learned? Because as you said, this is an important aspect of take up is learning something from someone you trust. So if a family member is treated and then they go talk about it with their families, that's another way of improving this community-based spread. So any comments from the panelists here? Maybe Brenda, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, no, I really like the way you flipped it. It's a very difficult experimental design problem, which, the academics can geek out about. But, again, it's also an opportunity, right, to hopefully increase the impact of your interventions, right, via those kinds of spillovers. So thinking about how to maximize those, I think, for instance, in the way that Allison was describing, I think is really exciting when we can pull it off. And I like the idea of kind of building from local strength, especially in contexts where the information environment may be more degraded. I was really struggling with what Sumitra said, because, of course, it's much harder to avoid the kind of nihilism that we would worry about these interventions preventing when you really don't know to what extent you can trust the previously reliable sources of news. And, I'm really circumspect about us telling people not to believe everything they hear and producing people who don't believe anything. So I think finding these local sources that produce reliable information in a verifiable way that people can see and experience, right, is a wonderful way to think about how we can square that circle.
Thanks. Anyone else have anything pressing?
I just say something quickly, is that many of our media literacy trainings target civil society organizations that do leave those trainings with a mandate to pass on what they've learned. It's part of the model. It's a kind of a training of trainers model.
Excellent. Thank you. So let's give the participants the panelists about 30 seconds to answer either there's a question about AI, the role of AI and when it comes to media literacy, or if you don't want to do that, what you think is the most promising area for future learnings. Sumitra, you want to start?
I just realized that the spillover effect question was addressed to me. So can I instead take the 30 seconds to answer that? So my answer is that, so there's a really great paper published in the American Economic Review on gender attitudes in schooling in India, where the researchers basically created a whole gender curriculum to get young men to have more liberal gender attitudes in a more patriarchal state in India. And I think one of the features of their design is that they want those children to go home and talk to their families and people in their village about it. And I thought that was a very promising idea. I'll try to drop the link in chat. What we're doing, we're trying to model that in many ways. So to answer the particular question about the spillover effect, we randomize at the village level, and we know that inter-village contact in India is not very high in our context because villages are systematically limited to certain communities in India, caste. So we randomize at the village level in order to prevent inter-village spillover. But within a village, we want people to talk to each other. It's just that the people who aren't getting treated are just not going to be in our study. So what we're hoping to do in future rounds of surveying is to get to neighbors of those in our study and parents of children to see if something was passed along. We don't expect that discernment will change, but maybe awareness about misinformation, something about trust. Don't know, we have a whole range of outcomes that we kind of try to measure. But I'll try to drop that AER paper in chat if I can find it in the next 30 seconds.
Okay, Allison, you want to give us a 30-second conclusion?
I'm going to say that we are very keen to see a greater interest, validity given to the idea of information ecosystem research that isn't randomized control trialing, as Brendan said, more like action research rooted in projects that can give us continuous feedback about the actual dynamics of local information ecosystems.
Thank you. Last word from Brendan.
I'll say I'm worried more about AI hype than AI. So I would encourage people to not let their programming get hijacked into AI focused hypotheticals. We just haven't seen the evidence that this is anywhere near the top of the list of threats. We should be attentive to it. Global South context may be more problematic. There may be audio based fakes that are easier to pull off than video, for instance. So we should be aware, but let's not take our eye off the ball based on hypotheticals. If it helps you get more resources, you can fold AI into your training. Fantastic, right? Ride the wave. But politicians, have always been and most likely will always be the most important sources of misinformation, and we should keep that in mind.
Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants for sticking with us till the end. These briefs are meant to be the start of a conversation, so we will continue to reach out to you with updates, and please stay engaged with us as we continue this work. Thank you all.
Thank you.